In the small town of Riverbrook, mailman Luke Garrett notices something wrong at Edith Parker's house. Her once tidy yard is overgrown, and the mail is piling up. When his concern leads him to a shocking discovery, Luke finds himself in a race to help Edith, uncovering a hidden battle she's been fighting alone. Will Luke be able to save her in time, or is it too late? Comment below with your thoughts on helping others, and subscribe for more powerful stories about community, compassion, and the unexpected connections that can change lives. Now let's dive into the mailman's secret. The small town of Riverbrook had a rhythm all its own. The mornings began with the soft hum of distant cars, the gentle clink of coffee cups being set on kitchen tables, and the occasional bark of dogs being let out into fenced backyards. There were no city sounds, no rush of traffic, no hurried footsteps or honking horns. Just the slow, steady pace of suburban life, where everyone knew each other's names and where routine wasn't just expected, but cherished. For Luke Garrett, Riverbrook's 31-year-old mailman, routine was the very foundation of his days. Every morning, without fail, he would rise at 5:30 a.m., shower, and pull on his neatly pressed blue postal uniform. His apartment was modest, but tidy, with everything in its proper place, a reflection of his need for order in an otherwise chaotic world. The sun was still rising by the time he finished his breakfast, but Luke didn't mind. He liked the quiet hours, when the town was still waking up, and the streets were empty save for the occasional jogger or dog walker. Luke's route hadn't changed in years. Starting from the post office on Main Street, he drove his postal van through the winding roads that made up the heart of Riverbrook. Each day, the same stops, the same friendly faces. He knew every house, every garden, and every crack in the sidewalk by heart. It gave him a sense of comfort, a connection to the place he'd called home for as long as he could remember. As Luke approached his first stop on Pineview Avenue, he parked the van and stepped out, the early morning air cool against his skin. He pulled the first few envelopes from his bag, his eyes scanning the addresses out of habit. The house was quiet, as it always was this time of day. Mr. and Mrs. Henderson, both retired, were probably still inside, sipping coffee and reading the newspaper. Luke could almost picture them in their living room, the smell of toast and eggs wafting through the air. He smiled to himself as he slid the mail into the slot, then walked back to the van. This was his life, a series of small, predictable moments that to some might seem dull. But to Luke, it was more than just a job. It was his connection to the people of Riverbrook, a way to be a part of their lives, even if only for a few brief seconds each day. As he drove down the street, he passed by Susan Higgins, the owner of the local diner, who was out front sweeping her porch. She waved as he went by, and Luke returned the gesture with a nod. "Morning, Susan," he called out, rolling down the window. "Morning," Susan replied with a smile. "You stop by later. You'll have some fresh coffee and donuts ready for you." "Sounds like a plan," Luke said, chuckling as he continued on his route. He made his way through the streets, delivering letters and packages to homes that had become as familiar to him as his own. Each stop was a brief but meaningful interaction, a wave, a smile, a quick conversation. These moments, fleeting as they were, formed the fabric of Luke's day. It wasn't just about delivering the mail, it was about the connections he made along the way, the relationships he'd built with the people he served. By the time Luke reached Elm Street, the sun was fully up, casting a warm golden glow over the town. He glanced at the house numbers as he pulled up to the curb in front of one of his favorite stops, Edith Parker's house. Edith Parker had lived in Riverbrook for as long as Luke could remember. She was in her early 80s now, a widow who had lost her husband, Harold, several years back. Her house, a small cottage with a white picket fence, was always immaculate. Edith took great pride in her home, and it showed. The lawn was always perfectly trimmed, the flower beds were neatly arranged with seasonal blooms, and the porch was swept clean every morning. But what Luke loved most about stopping at Edith's house wasn't the well-kept exterior, was the woman who lived inside. Edith had a warmth about her, a kindness that made everyone around her feel welcome. She was always waiting by the door when Luke arrived, a smile on her face, eager to chat for a few minutes before he continued on his way. She'd ask him about his day, offer him a cold drink in the summer, or a cup of hot tea in the winter. In a job that could sometimes feel monotonous, Edith was a bright spot. But today, something was off. As Luke stepped out of the van, he noticed that the usually pristine front yard was looking a little overgrown. The grass, normally trimmed to perfection, had grown long, and a few weeds had sprouted up in the flower beds. It was subtle, but to someone like Luke, who had been delivering mail to this house for years, it was noticeable. His brow furrowed as he approached the porch, where a small stack of newspapers had piled up. Edith always collected her newspapers in the morning, usually before Luke even arrived. He glanced at the mailbox, which was overflowing with letters and advertisements. That was odd, too. Edith was meticulous about checking her mail. She loved receiving letters from old friends and relatives, and she often made a point to chat with Luke about what she'd received. Luke knocked on the door, listening for the familiar sound of Edith's footsteps inside. But there was only silence. He waited a few moments, then knocked again, louder this time. "Mrs. Parker, it's Luke," he called out, but there was no response. A sense of unease began to creep over him. It wasn't like Edith to ignore the doorbell, and it definitely wasn't like her to let her mail pile up. Luke stood there for a moment, his mind racing with possibilities. Maybe she was visiting family. Maybe she wasn't feeling well and hadn't gotten around to the mail. But the longer he stood there, the more his concern grew. Luke glanced over at the house next door, where Mike Jenkins, Edith's neighbor, was out front watering his garden. Mike was a retired mechanic, a man of few words, but he and Edith had been neighbors for decades. Luke figured if anyone knew what was going on, it would be Mike. "Hey, Mike," Luke called, walking over to the fence. "You seen Mrs. Parker lately?" Mike looked up from his hose, his brow furrowing. "Come to think of it, no, I haven't," he said, his voice gruff but tinged with concern. "She used to be out in the garden every day, but I haven't seen her in a week or so. Figured she was visiting family or something." Luke nodded, his unease growing. "I knocked, but she didn't answer. Her mail's piling up, too. I'm starting to worry." Mike wiped his hands on his jeans, glancing over at Edith's house. "Yeah, that's not like her. Maybe you should check again tomorrow, see if she's back." Luke thanked Mike and returned to his van, but the knot of worry in his stomach didn't go away. As he drove down Elm Street, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Edith wasn't the type to just disappear without telling anyone, and if something had happened to her, he pushed the thought from his mind. Maybe she really was just visiting family, and everything would be back to normal tomorrow. But as he continued his route, the sense of unease lingered. The next morning, Luke woke up with the same nagging feeling in the pit of his stomach. He couldn't stop thinking about Edith. As he went through his usual morning routine, shower, breakfast, out the door, his mind kept drifting back to her overgrown lawn and the stack of newspapers on her porch. It wasn't like her, and the more he thought about it, the more he realized he couldn't ignore it. When Luke arrived at the post office to begin his route, he made a mental note to check on Edith again. Maybe she'd be back today, and everything would be fine. But something inside him, a small, persistent voice, told him that wasn't the case. As Luke drove through the streets of Riverbrook, delivering mail and exchanging pleasantries with the usual faces, his mind was elsewhere. He barely noticed the early morning joggers or the dog walkers who waved at him as he passed by. His thoughts were consumed by the unanswered question of what had happened to Edith. By the time he reached Elm Street, the knot in his stomach had grown tighter. He parked the van in front of her house and stepped out, his eyes immediately falling on the stack of newspapers, which had grown even larger since yesterday. The mailbox, too, was stuffed full of new letters. Luke's heart sank. He approached the door and knocked, louder this time. "Mrs. Parker, it's Luke, again. Just checking on you." Silence. Luke frowned, glancing around the yard.
The grass had grown even longer, and the once beautiful flower beds were now overrun with weeds.
It was as if the house itself was falling into neglect, its former charm fading with each passing day. Luke knocked again, this time harder. "Mrs. Parker, are you there?" he called, his voice louder than before. Still nothing. Luke stood there for a moment, his hand resting on the doorknob, debating what to do next. He knew it wasn't his place to pry, but something about the situation didn't sit right with him. Edith wasn't just a customer. She was a friend, someone he had come to care about over the years. And now it seemed like she had vanished without a trace. Just as he was about to turn and leave, Luke caught a whiff of something, an unpleasant odor, faint but noticeable, drifting from the cracks of the door. His heart skipped a beat. It was the smell of something sour, something off. It wasn't overpowering, but it was there, lingering in the air around the house. Luke's mind raced. Maybe she was inside, hurt or sick, and unable to call for help. The thought sent a surge of adrenaline through him. He knocked again, this time with urgency. "Mrs. Parker, please, if you're there, let me know." But once again there was only silence. Luke stepped back from the door, his heart pounding. He didn't know what to do. He wasn't family, he didn't have the right to just break in. But at the same time, he couldn't just walk away, not when something was clearly wrong. As he stood there, torn between his concern for Edith and the fear of overstepping, Luke decided he would give it one more day. If she didn't answer tomorrow, he'd have no choice but to get help. That night, Luke found himself lying awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to shake the growing sense of dread that had settled over him. The image of Edith's house overgrown, neglected, silent played on a loop in his mind.
He thought about the last time he had seen her, standing on her porch with a smile, handing him a cup of hot tea as they chatted about her garden.
It had been wintering then, and the air had been crisp and cold. Edith had been bundled up in her thick wool sweater, her cheeks rosy from the chill. She had laughed as she pointed to her rose bushes, which were still clinging to life despite the frost. "They're tough little things, those roses," she had said with a grin. "Just like me." Luke smiled at the memory. Edith had always been resilient, a woman who faced life's challenges head-on with a quiet strength. After Harold had passed, she had continued to live on her own, refusing to let loneliness or old age slow her down. She had always taken pride in her independence, in her ability to care for herself and her home. But now, as Luke lay there in the darkness, he couldn't help but wonder if that independence had come at a cost. Had Edith been hiding her struggles? Had she been trying to handle too much on her own, unwilling to ask for help? The thought gnawed at him, keeping him awake long after the rest of the town had fallen silent. The next morning, Luke rose early, determined to find answers. As he went through his routine, showering, dressing, eating breakfast, his mind was focused on one thing: checking on Edith. He couldn't wait any longer. He had to know if she was okay. As he drove his route, delivering mail and exchanging pleasantries with the usual faces, Luke felt a growing sense of urgency. He was distracted, his thoughts racing ahead to Elm Street, to the house that had once been a beacon of warmth and hospitality. By the time he reached Edith's house, the knot in his stomach had returned, tighter than ever. He parked the van and stepped out, his heart pounding in his chest. The newspapers were still there, now yellowing at the edges from days of exposure to the elements. The mailbox was overflowing, stuffed with letters and advertisements. And the smell, the sour odor that had been faint the day before, was now stronger, unmistakable. Luke didn't waste any time. He rushed up to the door and knocked hard, his fist pounding against the wood. "Mrs. Parker, it's Luke. Are you there?" Silence. His heart raced as he knocked again, louder this time. "Please, Edith, if you're in there, let me know." Nothing. Luke stepped back from the door, panic rising in his chest. He couldn't wait any longer. He had to do something. He pulled out his phone and dialed 911, his hands trembling as he explained the situation to the dispatcher. "There's an elderly woman who lives alone," Luke said, his voice shaking. "I'm her mailman. She hasn't been collecting her mail, and I think something's wrong. Her house? It doesn't smell right." The dispatcher's voice was calm, reassuring. "Well, send an officer to perform a welfare check immediately. Stay where you are, and we'll be there soon." Luke hung up, his heart still pounding. He stepped back from the door and waited, his mind racing with possibilities. What if he had waited too long? What if something terrible had happened to Edith and he hadn't acted soon enough? The minutes stretched on, each one feeling like an eternity. Finally, after what seemed like hours, Luke heard the distant wail of sirens. Relief washed over him as a police cruiser pulled up to the curb, the lights flashing. A tall, gruff-looking officer stepped out of the car and approached the house, his expression serious. "You the one who called this in?" the officer asked, his voice low and steady. Luke nodded, swallowing hard. "Yeah, I'm Luke Garrett, her mailman. I haven't seen her in days, and I'm really worried." The officer nodded, glancing at the house. "All right, Mr. Garrett. Well, check it out." As the officer made his way to the front door, Luke stood back, his heart in his throat. He watched as the officer knocked on the door, calling out, "Police Mrs. Parker, are you home?" There was no answer. The officer knocked again, harder this time, his brow furrowing as he listened for any sound from inside. When there was no response, he turned to Luke. "She lives alone?" the officer asked. "Yeah," Luke replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "She's a widow. No family around here." The officer nodded grimly. "We'll have to force entry." Luke's heart pounded as the officer moved toward the side of the house, looking for a way in. Moments later, Luke heard the sound of glass breaking, followed by the creak of a door opening. The officer disappeared inside. Luke stood on the porch, his breath catching in his throat. He didn't know what the officer would find inside, but whatever it was, he knew it wouldn't be good. Luke stood outside Edith Parker's house, his heart pounding in his chest as the police officer forced the door open. The sound of splintering wood echoed in the quiet neighborhood, and Luke felt a surge of dread wash over him. He had known something was wrong for days now, but the reality of what might be inside was overwhelming. As the officer disappeared into the house, the minutes stretched on. Luke stood frozen on the front porch, his thoughts racing. Had he waited too long to call for help? What if Edith was seriously hurt or worse, and it was his fault for not acting sooner? He thought back to the days before, when he had noticed the uncollected mail and the overgrown yard. He had told himself that she was probably just away, or that maybe she was feeling under the weather. But in the back of his mind, he had known. He had known something was wrong, and yet he had waited. That guilt sat heavy in his stomach now, growing with each passing second. Luke's phone buzzed in his pocket, and he pulled it out to see a text from Megan Rivera, his girlfriend. Megan had always been the practical one, the voice of reason when Luke got too caught up in his emotions. She was a nurse at Riverbrook General Hospital, and when Luke had told her about his concerns for Edith, she had urged him to act quickly. "Megan, how's it going? Did you call the police? Is she okay?" Luke stared at the message for a moment before typing a response. "Luke, I called them. They're inside now, but I don't know anything yet. I'm worried it's bad, Meg." He hit send and then shoved his phone back into his pocket, not wanting to be distracted if the officer returned with news. His mind was a whirlwind of guilt and fear. He couldn't stop picturing Edith as she had been the last time he saw her, frail but smiling, always eager to talk about her roses or ask how his day was going. The woman he had known was a pillar of strength, but now he didn't know what to expect. Just then, the officer reappeared at the front door. His expression was grim, and Luke's stomach dropped. "She's alive," the officer said, but his tone was far from reassuring. "Barely." Luke felt his knees go weak as the officer stepped aside to let the paramedics inside. They hurried past him with medical equipment, disappearing into the house where Edith lay. "She's in bad shape," the officer continued, his voice low. "We found her on the floor in the living room. Looks like she's been there for a while. Dehydrated, malnourished. And there's something else. We found some medical equipment looks like she's been trying to treat herself for something serious." Luke's heart sank. "What do you mean, treat herself?" The officer shook his head. "I'm not sure yet. The paramedics will know more once they get a better look at her. But it's not good." Luke stood there, his mind reeling. He had known Edith for years, and in all that time, she had never mentioned any serious health issues. But now, hearing the officer's words, it was clear that she had been struggling in silence. And Hehe, who had seen her almost every day, had missed all the signs. "I should have done something sooner," Luke muttered, more to himself than to the officer. The officer gave him a sympathetic look. "You did what you could, Mr. Garrett. You called for help, and that's what matters now." But Luke wasn't so sure. He watched as the paramedics wheeled Edith out of the house on a stretcher, her frail body barely visible beneath the blankets. An oxygen mask covered her face, and IV lines were attached to her arms. She looked so small, so vulnerable, and it broke Luke's heart. The paramedics loaded her into the ambulance, and Luke hurried over to one of them, his voice shaky. "Is she going to be okay?" The paramedic glanced at him, her expression serious. "It's hard to say right now. She's in critical condition, but we'll do everything we can. We're taking her to Riverbrook General. If you're family, you can follow us there." "I'm not family," Luke replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I've known her for a long time. I'll follow." The paramedic gave him a nod before climbing into the ambulance. As the vehicle pulled away, sirens blaring, Luke stood there on the curb, feeling utterly helpless. He had done what he could, but it didn't feel like enough. Luke arrived at Riverbrook General Hospital a few minutes after the ambulance, his heart still pounding in his chest. The drive over had been a blur, his mind consumed with worry for Edith. He parked his van in the visitor's lot and rushed inside, heading straight for the emergency room. The hospital was bustling with activity. Doctors and nurses hurried through the halls, their faces focused and determined. The smell of antiseptic filled the air, and the soft beeping of machines provided a constant, unsettling background noise. Luke felt out of place here, surrounded by people who knew what they were doing. All he could do was wait. As he approached the front desk, a nurse looked up from her computer and offered him a tired but polite smile. "Can I help you?" "I'm here for Edith Parker," Luke said, trying to keep the anxiety out of his voice. "She was just brought in." The nurse's smile faltered slightly, and she glanced at her computer screen, typing quickly. After a moment, she looked back at Luke with a more serious expression. "Edith Parker, yes. She's in the ER now. She's in critical condition, but the doctors are with her. Are you family?" "No, I'm just a friend," Luke replied, his stomach sinking. The nurse nodded sympathetically. "I'm sorry, but we can only give updates to immediate family members. If you'd like to wait, I can let you know when we have more information." Luke nodded, feeling the weight of the situation pressing down on him. "Thank you. I'll wait." He found an empty seat in the waiting room and sat down, his thoughts swirling. He pulled out his phone and saw another message from Megan, but he didn't have the energy to respond just yet. Instead, he leaned back in the chair, staring at the tiled floor, and tried to process everything that had happened. The hours seemed to drag on as Luke sat in that cold, sterile waiting room. He watched as doctors came and went, patients were wheeled in and out, and families sat anxiously, waiting for news. The longer he waited, the more his guilt grew. He couldn't stop thinking about all the times he had seen Edith over the year show she had always been there with a smile, asking him about his day. And now, she was fighting for her life, and he hadn't done enough to help her. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, a doctor approached him. She was wearing scrubs, her hair pulled back in a neat bun, and her face was lined with fatigue. She held a clipboard in one hand and gave Luke a small professional smile. "Mr. Garrett," she asked, glancing down at the clipboard. Luke stood up quickly, his heart pounding. "Yes, that's me. How is she? Is she going to be okay?" The doctor motioned for him to sit down, and Luke's stomach dropped. This wasn't a good sign. "Mrs. Parker is in critical condition," the doctor began, her tone calm but serious. "She's suffering from severe dehydration and malnutrition, and she has a serious infection. We've stabilized her for now, but her condition is still very fragile." Luke felt his throat tighten. "I didn't know she was sick," he whispered. "I didn't know it was this bad." The doctor nodded, her expression sympathetic. "She's been living with a serious illness cancer, we believe, for some time now. From what we can tell, she's been trying to manage it on her own, but without proper medical care, her condition has worsened." Cancer. Luke felt like the wind had been knocked out of him. Edith had never mentioned anything about cancer. How long had she been dealing with this, and why hadn't she told anyone? "She'll need extensive treatment moving forward," the doctor continued. "Well, need to run more tests to determine the full extent of her illness. But the important thing is that she's here now, and we'll do everything we can to help her." Luke nodded, but his mind was still spinning. "Cancer. Edith had been living with cancer, and he hadn't known. He had seen her every day, talked to her, shared moments of laughter and conversation. And yet she had been suffering in silence. The doctor gave him a small, reassuring smile. "You did the right thing by calling for help, Mr. Garrett. You may have saved her life." Luke swallowed hard, the weight of those words settling over him. He had saved her life, but only after waiting far too long to act. The guilt gnawed at him, but there was also a small spark of relief. He had done something in the end. He had called for help, and now Edith was getting the care she needed. "Thank you," Luke said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. The doctor nodded and stood up. "I'll keep you updated on her condition. For now, she's resting. You're welcome to stay here as long as you'd like." Luke watched as the doctor walked away, her clipboard in hand. He leaned back in the chair, his mind still racing. He had done the right thing, but it didn't feel like enough. Edith was in the hospital now, fighting for her life, and all he could do was wait. 2 days passed, and Luke visited the hospital every day after his mail route. Each time he sat by Edith's bedside, watching as she slowly regained her strength. Her face was still pale, her body frail, but there was a flicker of life in her eyes, a sign that she was fighting to stay with him. On the 3rd day, as Luke sat by her side, Edith stirred. Her eyelids fluttered, and she turned her head slightly, her gaze landing on him. "Luke," she whispered, her voice weak and raspy. Luke leaned forward, relief flooding through him. "Edith, you're awake." Edith blinked slowly, as if trying to remember where she was. "What happened?" "You collapsed," Luke said gently. "I was worried about you when you didn't answer the door. I called 911. They said you've been really sick." Edith closed her eyes for a moment, a soft sigh escaping her lips. "I didn't want anyone to know." Luke's heart ached at the sadness in her voice. "Why didn't you tell me you've been dealing with all of this on your own? You didn't have to." Edith's hand trembled slightly as she reached for his. Luke took her hand in his, holding it gently. "I didn't want to be a burden," Edith said softly, her voice barely audible. "After Harold, I didn't want anyone to worry about me." Luke shook his head, his throat tight with emotion. "You're not a burden, Edith. You've never been a burden. I just wish you had told me sooner. I could have helped." Edith's eyes filled with tears, and she gave him a weak smile. "You've helped more than you know, Luke. You saved me." The weight of her words settled over Luke, and he realized just how close he had come to losing her. If he hadn't called for help when he did, Edith might not have survived. But even in that moment of relief, the guilt still lingered. He had waited too long to act, and it had nearly cost her everything. "I'm just glad you're okay," Luke said quietly, squeezing her hand gently. "That's all that matters." Edith's smile faltered slightly, and she looked away, her expression distant. "I don't know how much longer I'll be okay, Luke," she said, her voice trembling. "The doctors? They said the cancer is bad." Luke's heart clenched. He had known the situation was serious, but hearing Edith say it out loud made it all the more real. "You're strong, Edith," Luke said, trying to keep his voice steady. "You've always been strong. You can get through this." Edith shook her head, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I don't know if I can, Luke. I'm tired. So tired." Luke felt a lump form in his throat. He didn't know what to say, how to comfort her in a situation that seemed so hopeless. But as he sat there holding her hand, Luke realized that it wasn't about having the right words. It was about being there for her, just as she had been there for him all these years. Edith had always been a constant presence in his life, a source of warmth and kindness. Now it was his turn to be there for her. "You're not alone, Edith," Luke said softly. "I'll be here, no matter what." Edith's eyes filled with gratitude, and she squeezed his hand weakly. "Thank you, Luke. That means more than you know." As they sat together in the quiet hospital room, Luke felt a sense of resolve settle over him. Edith had been through so much, but she didn't have to face this alone. He would be there for her no matter how difficult the road ahead might be. The days after Edith's hospitalization were difficult for Luke. He visited her every afternoon after completing his mail route, but each time he left the hospital, the weight of what had happened sat heavy in his chest. Edith had been through so much, And even though she was in a safe place now, Luke couldn't shake the guilt that he should have done more, that he should have acted sooner. But despite the heaviness in his heart, something unexpected began to happen in Riverbrook. News of Edith's illness spread through the town like wildfire. It wasn't Luke's intention to make her story public, had only confided in a few close friends, but in a small town like Riverbrook, word traveled fast. Soon people began asking questions. At the post office, neighbors and friends inquired about Edith, their faces full of concern. "How's Mrs. Parker doing?" asked Susan Higgins, the owner of the local diner, as Luke stopped in for his morning coffee. Luke appreciated the concern, though it still felt strange to discuss Edith's private struggles so openly. "She's hanging in there," Luke replied, stirring sugar into his coffee. "But it's tough. She's still in the hospital, and the doctors are running more tests. They're trying to figure out the best treatment for her cancer." Susan's eyes softened with sympathy. "Poor thing. She's always been so independent. It must be hard for her to go through all this alone." "She's not alone," Luke said quickly, surprising himself with the strength of his own voice. "She has people who care about her." Susan smiled warmly. "Of course she does. And if there's anything we can do to help, just let us know." The whole town would pitch in if it meant making her life a little easier. Luke didn't expect what happened next. Within days, Susan and other members of the community organized a fundraising event at the diner to help cover Edith's medical expenses. They set up donation jars at local businesses, posted flyers around town, and even started an online crowdfunding campaign for those who had moved away but still wanted to help. Riverbrook, with its small population and tight-knit community, rallied around Edith in a way Luke had never seen before. People who hadn't spoken to her in years came forward, eager to help in any way they could. Some offered to mow her lawn or water her garden while she recovered, and others volunteered to drive her to and from the hospital once she was discharged. Even Mike Jenkins, her usually gruff neighbor, surprised Luke by offering to take care of Edith's beloved rose bushes while she was away. "Can't let those beauties die," Mike had grumbled, though Luke could see the concern in his eyes. The response was overwhelming, and Luke was deeply moved by the outpouring of support. It was a reminder of why he had chosen to stay in Riverbrook all these years. The town had its flaws, like anywhere else, but it was also a place where people looked out for one another. And now, in Edith's time of need, the community was coming together to support her. As the fundraiser at the diner approached, Luke found himself both hopeful and anxious. He had never been the type to seek attention or put himself in the spotlight, but Susan insisted that he speak at the event, if only to thank everyone for their generosity. He wasn't sure what he would say, but he knew he had to do it for Edith. The night of the fundraiser, the diner was packed. Tables were pushed together to make room for the auction items donated by local businesses, and a stage had been set up near the back for a short program of speakers. The smell of home-cooked meals filled the air, burgers sizzling on the grill, fries crisping in the fryer, and freshly baked pies cooling on the counter. Luke stood in the corner, watching as people milled about, placing bids on items and chatting about Edith. He had been surprised by how many people had come out to show their support, people from all corners of Riverbrook, from young families to older couples who had known Edith for years. Susan, wearing an apron and a bright smile, approached Luke with a cup of coffee in hand. "Ready to say a few words?" she asked, her eyes twinkling with encouragement. Luke took the cup gratefully, though his stomach churned with nerves. "I guess so," he said, managing a small smile. "I'm not really used to speaking in front of crowds." "You'll do great," Susan assured him. "Just speak from the heart. Everyone here wants to hear from you. They know how much you've done for Edith." Luke wasn't sure if he had done all that much, but he nodded and followed Susan to the stage. As he climbed the few steps and faced the crowd, the noise in the room gradually quieted. All eyes were on him, and for a moment Luke's throat tightened with anxiety. But then he looked out at the sea of familiar faces, people who cared, people who wanted to help, and he felt a sense of calm wash over him. He cleared his throat and began to speak. "I just want to thank everyone for being here tonight," Luke said, his voice steady despite the butterflies in his stomach. "I know Edith would be overwhelmed by all the support you've shown. She's always been someone who took pride in her independence, and I think that's why a lot of us didn't realize just how much she was going through." He paused, scanning the room, and saw nods of understanding. "She's been dealing with a lot," Luke continued, his voice softening. "More than I think any of us knew. But the thing is, she's not alone. She has all of us. And seeing everyone come together like this, it just shows how special Riverbrook is. We take care of each other here, and I know Edith is going to be okay, because she has all of you." There was a round of applause, and Luke felt his heart swell with gratitude. He hadn't expected to feel so emotional, but standing there, surrounded by people who cared so deeply for Edith, he realized just how much the town meant to him, and how much it meant to Edith, too. As the night went on, Luke watched as people placed bids, made donations, and shared stories about Edith. It was a night full of laughter and kindness, a celebration of the strength of their community. And as Luke left the diner that night, he felt a renewed sense of hope for Edith's future. Despite the overwhelming support from the community, Luke couldn't shake the gnawing feeling of doubt that lingered at the back of his mind. No matter how many people rallied around Edith, no matter how much money they raised, he couldn't help but wonder if it was too little, too late. Every time he visited Edith in the hospital, the weight of his earlier inaction pressed down on him. She was improving slowly, but the sight of her frail body, hooked up to machines and IV lines, was a constant reminder of how close they had come to losing her. And every time he sat by her bed, holding her hand or reading to her from the books she loved, he couldn't stop thinking about how long he had waited before calling for help. He had driven by her house day after day, seen the uncollected mail and the neglected yard, and yet he had hesitated. He had told himself that it wasn't his place, that maybe she was just away or under the weather. But deep down, he had known something was wrong, and he hadn't acted soon enough. One afternoon, as Luke sat in the hospital waiting room after one of his visits, Megan joined him. She had just finished her shift at the hospital and had come to check in on him, sensing that he was struggling. "You've been quiet lately," Megan said gently, sitting beside him in the stiff plastic chair. "What's on your mind?" Luke sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I can't stop thinking about what I could have done differently," he admitted, his voice heavy with guilt. "I should have noticed sooner. I should have called for help days ago." Megan reached out and placed a comforting hand on his arm. "Luke, you did everything you could. You called for help when you realized something was wrong, and that's what matters. You saved her life." "But what if I waited too long?" Luke asked, his voice thick with emotion. "What if she doesn't make it, because I didn't act fast enough?" Megan's eyes softened with empathy. "You can't think like that. You can't carry that weight on your shoulders forever. What happened to Edith isn't your fault. She made choices too. She didn't tell anyone she was sick. She didn't ask for help. And while that doesn't make it any easier, you have to remember that you did everything you could when it mattered most." Luke nodded, though the guilt still gnawed at him. He knew Megan was right, he couldn't change the past. But that didn't stop the memories from playing on a loop in his mind. The sight of Edith's house, the overgrown garden, the uncollected mail-it, all felt like a series of missed signals, a trail of clues he had failed to follow in time. "I just keep thinking about all the times I talked to her," Luke said quietly. "All the times she asked me about my day, or told me about her roses. And the whole time she was dealing with cancer, and I didn't even know. How could I have missed that?" Megan squeezed his arm gently. "Edith didn't want anyone to know. She's always been independent, and I'm sure she didn't want to be a burden. But that doesn't mean you should blame yourself for not noticing. People hide things, Luke, even from the ones who care about them most." Luke leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes for a moment. He knew Megan was right, but it didn't make the guilt any easier to bear. He had been a part of Edith's life for years. Shouldn't he have known when something was wrong? After a few moments of silence, Megan spoke again. "You know, it's easy to think about what we could have done differently, but that doesn't change what actually happened. What matters is what we do moving forward. Edith has a long road ahead of her, and she's going to need all the support she can get. You've already done so much for her, Luke. Just keep being there for her. Luke nodded, letting Megan's words sink in. She was right, he couldn't change the past, but he could be there for Edith now, in the present. He could help her through whatever came next, no matter how difficult it might be. He'll be there for her, Luke said quietly, his voice filled with resolve. No matter what. Just when it seemed like Edith's condition was improving, disaster struck. It had been several weeks since Edith had been hospitalized, and while her progress was slow, the doctors were cautiously optimistic. The infection she had developed had been treated, and her strength was beginning to return. Luke had visited her every day, bringing updates from the town and reading to her from the books she loved. There were moments of hope, brief flickers of the old Edith shining through. But then, one afternoon, Luke received a call from the hospital. He had just finished his mail route and was preparing to head home when his phone buzzed in his pocket. The number on the screen was unfamiliar, but the hospital's area code made his heart race with dread. "Hello," Luke answered, his voice tight with anxiety. "Mr. Garrett," came the voice on the other end of the line. "This is Dr. Fields from Riverbrook General. I'm afraid I have some difficult news about Edith Parker." Luke's stomach dropped. He gripped the phone tighter, his pulse quickening. "What happened?" "Edith has developed a secondary infection, Dr. Fields explained, his tone grave. "Her immune system is still compromised from the cancer and the malnutrition. We're doing everything we can, but her condition is critical. I wanted to let you know, in case you'd like to come by and see her." Luke felt like the ground had been pulled out from beneath him. Just when he had started to believe that Edith was on the road to recovery, this new setback threatened to undo all the progress she had made. "He'll be there right away," Luke said, his voice shaky. The drive to the hospital felt like it took an eternity, though it was only a few minutes away. By the time Luke arrived, his hands were trembling and his heart was racing. He rushed through the hospital corridors, barely acknowledging the familiar faces of nurses and staff as he made his way to Edith's room. When he arrived, Dr. Fields was waiting for him outside the door. The doctor's expression was serious, and Luke could see the weariness in his eyes. "She's in a fragile state, Dr. Fields explained, his voice soft but firm. "The infection is serious, and her body is struggling to fight it off. We're administering antibiotics, but it's going to be a tough battle." Luke nodded, his throat tight with emotion. "Can I see her, Doctor?" Fields gave a small nod. "Of course. She's sedated, but she may be able to hear you." Luke pushed open the door to Edith's room and stepped inside. The sight of her, pale and still in the hospital bed, hit him like a punch to the gut. Machines beeped steadily, monitoring her vital signs, and an IV drip delivered medication into her frail body. Her face, once so full of life, was drawn and exhausted. He sat down in the chair beside her bed, reaching for her hand. It was cold to the touch, and he gently held it in his own, trying to ignore the fear gnawing at his insides. "I'm here, Edith," Luke whispered, his voice shaking. "I'm right here." There was no response, but Luke knew she could hear him. He hoped, at least. He sat there for what felt like hours, holding her hand, whispering words of encouragement, telling her stories about the town, about the fundraiser at the diner, about all the people who were rooting for her. He talked because it was the only thing he knew how to do, the only thing that kept him from breaking down completely. "You've come this far, Edith," Luke whispered, his voice cracking. "You've made it through so much. I know you can make it through this, too. Just hold on a little longer." But as the hours passed, Luke's hope began to waver. He couldn't help but wonder if this was it, if Edith had finally reached the end of her fight. The thought terrified him, but it also made him realize just how much she had come to mean to him. She wasn't just another resident on his mail route. She was a friend, a part of his life, someone who had always been there with a kind word and a smile. And now the thought of losing her felt unbearable. As the night wore on, Luke stayed by Edith's side, refusing to leave. He would be there for her, just as she had always been there for him. No matter how long it took, no matter how difficult the road ahead might be, he wouldn't give up on her. Luke stayed by Edith's bedside throughout the night, his body aching from exhaustion, but his mind too restless to sleep. The hospital room was dimly lit, the soft glow of the machines casting eerie shadows on the walls. The rhythmic beeping of Edith's heart monitor and the quiet hum of the IV pump were the only sounds that filled the air, creating a sense of isolation that weighed heavily on Luke. He couldn't leave her, not now, not when things were so uncertain. The nurses came in every few hours to check her vitals and adjust her medications, but each time they gave Luke the same solemn look. There wasn't much they could do beyond what they were already doing. The antibiotics were working, but Edith's body was fragile, and the infection was relentless. Luke squeezed her hand gently, his heart aching at how cold and frail it felt in his grasp. He had never felt so helpless. Edith had always been a symbol of quiet strength to him, a woman who had endured so much in her life, from the loss of her husband to her battle with cancer, yet had always carried herself with grace. And now, here she was, fighting for her life, and there was nothing Luke could do to help her. "Edith," he whispered softly, leaning closer to her, "I need you to fight. You've made it through so much already. Please don't give up now." He wasn't sure if she could hear him, but he hoped his words would reach her somehow, deep in the recesses of her mind. He wanted her to know she wasn't alone. She had people who loved him, the community of Riverbrook, everyone who had rallied around her in her time of need. She mattered. As the hours dragged on, Luke found himself reflecting on their friendship. What had started as a simple mailman-customer relationship had grown into something much deeper. Edith had become a part of his life in a way he hadn't anticipated. She had been a source of warmth and kindness in his daily routine, a person he could count on for a kind word or a thoughtful conversation. He couldn't imagine his life in Riverbrook without her. At some point in the early hours of the morning, Megan arrived at the hospital. She had finished her shift at Riverbrook General and had come to check on Luke, sensing that he needed support. When she walked into the room, she found him sitting at Edith's bedside, his head bowed, his eyes red from lack of sleep. "Hey," Megan said softly, placing a hand on his shoulder. "How's she doing?" Luke looked up at her, exhaustion etched into his features. "Not good," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "The doctors are doing everything they can, but she's not responding like they hoped." Megan nodded, her heart heavy with sympathy. "It's always hardest when there's nothing more you can do," she said, her voice gentle. "But you being here, it matters. Even if she can't respond, she knows you're with her." Luke swallowed hard, his throat tight with emotion. I don't want her to be alone." Megan squeezed his shoulder reassuringly. "She's not alone, and she never will be." For a few minutes, they sat in silence, the weight of the moment pressing down on both of them. Megan understood the gravity of what Luke was feeling. As a nurse, she had seen patients in similar situations, and she knew how hard it was to face the uncertainty of whether someone you cared about would make it through. After a while, Megan spoke again, her voice soft but firm. "You know, Luke, whatever happens, you've done right by her. You've been here every step of the way. You've given her something so many people don't get, a friend who truly cares." Luke blinked back tears, trying to hold himself together. "I just want her to be okay." Megan nodded. "I know. We all do." The next day, something changed. It was subtle at first, just a slight improvement in Edith's vital signs. The nurses noticed it during their routine checks, and by the afternoon, Dr. Fields had confirmed that the antibiotics were starting to take effect. The infection, while still serious, was beginning to recede. Luke could hardly believe it when he heard the news. After so many hours of uncertainty and fear, this tiny glimmer of hope felt like a lifeline. He stayed close by Edith's side, watching her closely for any sign of improvement. Her breathing became a little steadier, her color slightly better, and though she remained unconscious, there was a sense that her body was fighting back. Dr. Fields approached Luke later that afternoon, his expression more hopeful than it had been in days. "She's not out of the woods yet," he cautioned, "but we're seeing some positive changes. Her body is responding to the treatment, and if things continue on this trajectory, there's a chance she'll pull through." Luke felt a rush of relief, though he was careful not to get his hopes too high. There was still a long way to go, but for the first time in days, he allowed himself to believe that Edith might survive this. That evening, Luke sat by her bedside again, his fingers gently brushing against hers. He had taken to reading to her from one of her favorite books, Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. It was one of the few books that Edith had talked about in their many conversations, a novel she had read countless times over the years. As he read aloud, his voice quiet but steady, Luke imagined that Edith could hear him. He hoped that his voice, familiar and comforting, would reach through the haze of her unconsciousness and give her strength. He wanted her to know that she wasn't alone, that he was still there, fighting alongside her. As the night wore on, something remarkable happened. Edith's fingers twitched in his hand, a small but unmistakable movement. Luke's heart skipped a beat, and he paused, staring down at her hand in disbelief. "Edith," he whispered, his voice filled with hope. There was no further movement, but the slight twitch had been enough to fill Luke with renewed optimism. He called for the nurse, who confirmed that Edith's condition was indeed improving. It was slow, and she still had a long way to go, but she was beginning to wake up. Over the next several days, Edith's recovery progressed. Her body, weakened by the infection and the cancer, continued to fight back, and slowly but surely, she began to regain consciousness. The day she opened her eyes for the first time since the setback, Luke was there, holding her hand and whispering words of encouragement. Her eyes fluttered open, and for a moment she looked disoriented, her gaze unfocused. But then her eyes found Luke's, and a flicker of recognition passed over her face. "Luke," she whispered, her voice weak but filled with emotion. Luke felt tears well up in his eyes as he squeezed her hand. "I'm here, Edith," he said, his voice shaking. "I'm right here." Edith blinked slowly, her lips curving into the faintest smile. "You stayed." "Of course I stayed," Luke replied, his throat tight with emotion. "I'm not going anywhere." For the first time in weeks, Luke felt a sense of relief wash over him. Edith was awake. She was still fragile, still fighting, but she was alive. And that was all that mattered. As the days passed, Edith grew stronger. She was moved out of the ICU and into a regular room where she continued her recovery. Luke visited her every day, just as he had before. And each time he saw her, she looked a little better, her skin a little less pale, her voice a little stronger. It was a slow process, but there was progress. One afternoon, as Luke sat by her bedside, Edith looked at him with a tired but grateful expression. "You saved my life, Luke," she said quietly, her voice filled with sincerity. Luke shook his head, his heart full of emotion. "No, Edith, you saved your own life. You fought through all of this. I was just here to make sure you didn't have to do it alone." Edith smiled softly, tears glistening in her eyes. "I couldn't have done it without you." For a moment, they sat in silence, the weight of everything they had been through settling over them. It had been a long, difficult journey, one filled with fear, uncertainty, and pain. But they had made it through together. As Edith's condition continued to improve, the doctors began discussing her discharge plans. She would still need ongoing treatment for her cancer, but the immediate danger had passed, and she was strong enough to leave the hospital. It was a moment both Luke and Edith had been waiting for, though it came with its own set of challenges. "I can't go back to living alone," Edith admitted one afternoon, her voice tinged with sadness. "I don't have the strength to take care of myself like I used to." Luke nodded, understanding her concerns. "Well, figure it out," he said gently. "You don't have to do this alone. There are options care facilities, home health aides. We'll find a solution." Edith looked thoughtful, her eyes distant. "I've been thinking about it a lot, and I think it's time to let go of the house. It's too much for me now. I've held on to it because of Harold, but I think it's time." Luke's heart ached at the sadness in her voice, but he knew she was right. Edith had spent so many years in that house, filling it with memories of her life with Harold. But now she needed a new beginning, a fresh start, where she could focus on her health and well-being. "We'll find you a good place," Luke said softly. "Somewhere where you'll be comfortable and well taken care of. And I'll visit you every day." Edith smiled at him, her eyes filled with gratitude. "I know you will." In the weeks that followed, Luke and Edith worked together to find a care facility where she could live comfortably while receiving the medical support she needed. It wasn't an easy decision, but Edith felt at peace with it. She knew she wasn't saying goodbye to the life she had built in Riverbrook. She was simply starting a new chapter. The day Edith moved into the facility, Luke was by her side, helping her settle in and bringing her familiar items from home, her favorite quilt, a framed photo of her and Harold, and a stack of books she loved. The room was small but cozy, with a view of a garden outside the window. Edith seemed at ease, and Luke felt a sense of relief knowing she was in a place where she would be cared for. As he sat with her that afternoon, watching the sunlight stream through the window, Luke realized just how much Edith had come to mean to him. She wasn't just a resident on his mail route, she was family. And no matter what the future held, he would be there for her, just as she had always been there for him. Several months had passed since Edith had moved into her new home, and life in Riverbrook had returned to its quiet rhythm. The seasons had changed, bringing the warmth of summer to the town. Luke continued his mail route, greeting the familiar faces of the town's residents and enjoying the simple pleasures of his routine. But there was something different, now a deeper connection to the community and a sense of purpose that went beyond delivering mail. Every afternoon, Luke visited Edith at the care facility. They spent hours talking, laughing, and reminiscing about the past. Edith had made new friends at the facility, and her health had stabilized. She was still undergoing treatment for her cancer, but she was stronger now, and there was a lightness in her spirit that hadn't been there before. One sunny afternoon, as Luke sat with Edith in the garden outside the facility, she turned to him with a thoughtful expression. "You know, Luke," she said softly, "I've been thinking a lot about how lucky I am. I've had a good life, but what I'm most grateful for is the people I've met along the way, people like you." Luke smiled, his heart full of warmth. "I'm the lucky one, Edith. You've taught me so much about resilience, about kindness, about what it means to really care about someone." Edith reached out and took his hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. "You saved me, Luke. Not just my life, but my spirit. I was lost for a long time, but you helped me find my way back." Luke felt tears prick his eyes, but he blinked them away, squeezing her hand in return. We helped each other. As they sat there in the warm afternoon sun, surrounded by the scent of blooming flowers and the soft rustling of leaves, Luke realized that he had found something he hadn't even known he was looking for: a sense of belonging, a deeper connection to the people around him, and a renewed understanding of what it meant to be part of a community. The story of Edith's struggle and her eventual recovery had touched more lives than either of them could have imagined. The people of Riverbrook had rallied around her, showing what it meant to truly care for one another. And in the process, they had reminded Luke of the importance of small, everyday acts of kindness, the kind of kindness that could save lives. As the sun began to set, casting a warm golden glow over the garden, Edith leaned back in her chair, her eyes twinkling with contentment. "It's a beautiful day," she said softly. Luke nodded, his heart full. "It really is." And in that moment, Luke knew that no matter what the future held, he and Edith would face it together, surrounded by the strength of their community and the unbreakable bond they had formed. Sometimes, the most unexpected connections can shape our lives in profound ways. If you've been moved by this story and want to hear more heartwarming tales like this one, make sure to hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss any future updates. Every story has the power to inspire, and we have plenty more to share with you. Join us on this journey of storytelling, empathy, and community. Be a part of something bigger by subscribing, and together we can spread positivity, one story at a time. Let me know how it goes. In the months that followed, Ryan spearheaded a new task force within the department aimed at ensuring the responsible use of technology in policing. The Ethical Policing Technology Initiative (EPTI) was designed to oversee how new tools were implemented, making sure they adhered to strict privacy standards and weren't being used in a discriminatory manner. Ryan worked closely with civil liberties groups, tech experts, and community leaders to develop guidelines that ensured transparency and accountability. Officers were required to undergo specialized training on how to use these tools ethically. and new oversight measures were put in place to monitor their deployment. The program wasn't without its critics. Some officers complained that the new rules made their jobs harder, while certain tech companies pushed back against what they saw as unnecessary restrictions. But Ryan stood firm, knowing that without proper oversight, the technology could do more harm than good. During one particularly tense department meeting, an officer raised his hand, frustration evident in his voice. "With all due respect, Deputy Chief," he began, "why are we handcuffing ourselves? This technology can help us catch criminals faster. Why put so many restrictions on it?" Ryan met the officer's gaze, understanding the concern but remaining resolute. "Because our job isn't just to catch criminals," he said. "Our job is to protect the people, and that means protecting their rights too. If we start sacrificing privacy and civil liberties in the name of efficiency, then we're not doing our jobs. We're just cutting corners." The room was silent for a moment, and Ryan could see the wheels turning in the officer's mind. It was a tough balancing act, but Ryan knew it was necessary. The future of policing wasn't about brute force or unchecked surveillance. It was about thoughtful, ethical approaches that respected the people they served. 2 years later, the Ethical Policing Technology Initiative had become a model for departments across the country. Ryan had been invited to speak at several national conferences, sharing the lessons they had learned about balancing public safety with civil liberties. The success of the initiative had solidified his reputation as a forward-thinking leader in law enforcement reform. Jordan, too, had continued his advocacy work, pushing for nationwide adoption of similar standards. The two men, despite their different approaches, remained close friends and collaborators, each pushing the other to do better. One evening, after a long day, Ryan received a message from Jordan dinner at my place. When Ryan arrived, Jordan was already grilling steaks on the back porch. The smell of sizzling meat filled the air as they sat down to catch up. "You know, I never thought we'd be here," Jordan said as they ate. "When we started all this, I didn't think we'd actually get to a point where the system would listen to us." Ryan smiled. "I think we both underestimated the power of persistence." Jordan laughed. "You're right about that. But we're not done yet, are we?" "No," Ryan said, his tone serious. "We're not. But we're making progress." They clinked their beer bottles together, a silent toast to the years of hard work and the victories they had earned. The road had been long and filled with obstacles, but they had made a difference, one step at a time. As the sun set over the city, casting a warm glow over the skyline, Ryan and Jordan sat in comfortable silence, watching the world they had helped shape. The challenges they had faced, the battles they had fought, had all been worth it. They had built something lasting, something that would continue long after they were gone. Ryan couldn't help but think about the young officers coming up through the ranks, the ones who would carry on the work he had started. Officers like Naomi Green, who now led a unit focused on community engagement, were the future of policing. They represented a new generation that believed in fairness, justice, and the importance of doing things the right way. "I think the future's in good hands," Ryan said, more to himself than to Jordan. Jordan looked over at him, his expression thoughtful. "Yeah, I think it is." The two men sat back, content in the knowledge that while their work was never truly done, they had laid a foundation that would stand the test of time. And as long as there were people willing to stand up for what was right, there would always be hope for a better, more just world. A few more years passed, and Ryan Carter's career had reached heights he never imagined when he first joined the force. Now, as the chief of police, Ryan was responsible not only for the reforms that had already taken place, but also for leading the department through new social, technological, and ethical challenges. His success as a reformer had made him a widely respected figure, but it had also placed him under intense scrutiny. Every move he made, every decision he authorized, was dissected by the media and the public. The new debate consuming the city was centered around the rise in community-led safety initiatives. Many neighborhoods, particularly those that had experienced tense relations with the police in the past, were advocating for more localized, community-based public safety programs. These initiatives emphasized conflict resolution, mental health intervention, and restorative justice over traditional policing methods. Ryan understood the community's desire to have a more direct role in keeping their neighborhoods safe. After all, much of the progress they had made over the years was due to increased collaboration between the police and the public. But there were concerns within the department about the implications of scaling back traditional policing in favor of untested community models. One afternoon, as Ryan sat reviewing proposals for community-led initiatives, his deputy, Lieutenant Denise Martin, walked into his office. Denise had been one of Ryan's strongest allies during the reform years, helping him navigate the pushback from the old guard while building support among the rank-and-file officers. "Chief, you've seen the latest push from the city council, right?" Denise asked, a hint of concern in her voice. Ryan nodded, gesturing for her to take a seat. "Yeah, I've been going over it. Community Safety Initiative, they're calling it. They want to divert some funding from the police budget to support it." Denise frowned. "I get where they're coming from, but are they really ready for this? We're talking about removing traditional law enforcement presence in some of the most at-risk neighborhoods. Are we setting them up to fail?" Ryan leaned back in his chair, thinking carefully before responding. "I don't think we should look at it as us versus them. The goal is the same: keeping people safe. The way we've done things isn't the only way to do it. But if we're going to make this work, we need to be partners in the process." Denise nodded, her expression softening. "You think we can pull that off?" Ryan smiled slightly. "We've done harder things." A few days later, Ryan met with Councilwoman Elena Reyes, one of the main architects of the Community Safety Initiative. The two had worked together closely on previous reforms, but this new initiative was pushing them into uncharted territory. Still, Ryan was determined to keep the lines of communication open. Chief Carter, Councilwoman Reyes, greeted him warmly as they sat down in her office. "Thank you for taking the time. I know this isn't an easy conversation." Ryan smiled. "That's why we're here to have the hard conversations. We both want the same thing: safer communities." Reyes nodded, her tone more serious now. "Exactly. But we believe that safety doesn't always have to come from a police presence. These community programs have been shown to reduce violence and increase trust between residents. We want to give people the tools to resolve conflicts without always having to rely on law enforcement." Ryan took a deep breath. "I understand that, and I think there's a lot of potential here. But we also need to make sure that when people call for help, they get the response they need. There are situations where trained law enforcement is necessary, when violence escalates or when people's lives are at risk. We can't ignore that reality." Reyes leaned forward, her eyes thoughtful. "That's why we need your help. We're not talking about eliminating police presence, we're talking about complementing it. Working together with the community instead of always being the first line of defense." Ryan nodded. "I'm open to that. Let's figure out how we can build this partnership. But we need clear guidelines on when the police should step in and when the community can handle things on their own. We also need to make sure that officers aren't feeling like they're being sidelined. If we're going to shift some of the responsibility, we need to bring everyone to the table." Reyes smiled. "That's exactly what I was hoping to hear." Over the next few months, the Community Safety Initiative took shape. Ryan and his team worked closely with the City Council and community leaders to design a pilot program that would test the new model in several neighborhoods. The initiative focused on training community members in conflict resolution, mental health first aid, and de-escalation tactics, while keeping a close line of communication with the police for situations that required their involvement. Jordan, ever the advocate for grassroots solutions, was thrilled with the progress. "This is exactly what we've been talking about for years," Jordan said one evening over dinner with Ryan. "Empowering the community to take ownership of their own safety. If this works, it could be a game changer." Ryan nodded, though he remained cautious. "I want it to work as much as you do. But we have to be prepared for things to go wrong, too. If the community doesn't feel supported, or if the police feel like they're being cut out of the process, this could backfire." Jordan raised his glass. "That's why we have you keeping everyone on the same page." Ryan chuckled, clinking his glass against Jordan's. "Let's hope it's enough." As the program rolled out, there were successes and setbacks. In some neighborhoods, the community-led safety efforts resulted in a noticeable decrease in calls for police intervention. People began resolving disputes among themselves, and trust between residents and law enforcement improved. But in other areas, old tensions resurfaced. Some officers felt their authority was being undermined, while certain residents still feared police involvement, leading to hesitations in calling for help when it was really needed. Ryan worked tirelessly to address these issues, meeting with officers and community leaders, adjusting the program as needed. He knew this was part of the growing pains of any new initiative, but he also knew they couldn't afford to let the early successes slip away. The true test of the Community Safety Initiative came one night when a major confrontation erupted between two rival groups in one of the pilot neighborhoods. The conflict had escalated quickly, with rumors of violence spreading through social media. Normally, the police would have responded immediately, but this time, the community leaders who had been trained through the initiative decided to step in first. Ryan and his team were on standby, monitoring the situation closely. He had already instructed the officers to be ready to intervene if things got out of hand. But he was hoping that the community could de-escalate the situation without the need for force. For hours, tensions ran high as the trained mediators worked to calm both sides. The situation was touch and go, but just as things seemed like they were about to erupt into violence, a breakthrough happened. The leaders of both groups agreed to meet, with the mediators acting as go-betweens, and after a tense negotiation, they reached a resolution without a single arrest or injury. When Ryan received the call that the situation had been resolved peacefully, he felt a wave of relief wash over him. "We did it," Denise said, her voice filled with awe as she stood beside Ryan in the precinct's command center. Ryan nodded, his expression serious. "The community did it. We were there to back them up, but they handled it on their own." Jordan called Ryan that night, excited about the news. "This is huge, man, proof that this model works. People are going to take notice." Ryan smiled but remained grounded. "It's a big step, but we have to stay focused. This isn't a one-time thing. We need to keep refining the process, making sure that both the community and the police are working together." Months later, the success of the pilot program had attracted national attention. Cities across the country were interested in replicating the model, and Ryan was once again at the forefront of a new wave of reform. This time, the focus wasn't just on how police could change, but on how entire communities could take ownership of their safety while still collaborating with law enforcement. Jordan, as always, remained by Ryan's side, helping to push the legal framework for these initiatives across the country. The two friends had come a long way from that fateful night they had been pulled over. Their partnership had transformed the city and was now shaping the future of public safety nationwide. As Ryan sat in his office preparing for yet another interview with a national news outlet about the program's success, he couldn't help but reflect on how far they had come. The road hadn't been easy, and there were still challenges ahead. But they had built something lasting, something that would change lives for generations to come. Looking out the window at the city he had dedicated his life to, Ryan smiled. The work was never done, but for the first time, he felt truly optimistic about the future. They had started with a fight for justice, but now they were building a future of hope, partnership, and community-led safety. And as long as people were willing to work together, Ryan knew that anything was possible. A few years had passed since the Community Safety Initiative had been fully implemented across the city. The initiative had matured, becoming an example of how community and law enforcement could work together in harmony without one undermining the other. While there were still challenges, the overwhelming success had drawn attention from policymakers, activists, and law enforcement agencies across the country. Ryan Carter, now nearing retirement age, was in a reflective mood. After decades of service, he knew his time as the city's police chief was coming to an end. And while he looked forward to stepping back from the pressures of the job, he also felt the weight of leaving behind a legacy. Jordan, meanwhile, had taken his advocacy work to a national level. He was now leading efforts to pass federal legislation aimed at reshaping policing standards across the United States. They were both busy men, but their friendship remained as strong as ever. One evening, as Ryan sat at his kitchen table going over the plans for his final year in office, his phone buzzed. It was a message from Jordan Need to talk. Big news! Let's meet tomorrow. Ryan smiled to himself. Jordan always had big news. Over the years, they had shared so many victories, setbacks, and countless moments of celebration and frustration. But it was their shared vision that had kept them moving forward. The next day, Ryan met Jordan at a small diner they used to frequent in their early days as young professionals. It felt nostalgic, sitting in the same booth where they had once dreamed of making a difference. Now, years later, they had done more than dream, they had transformed their city. "All right, Jordan, what's this big news?" Ryan asked as he settled into the booth. Jordan leaned forward, his eyes bright with excitement. "I've been talking with some of the top people in Washington. They want to take what we've done here with the Community Safety Initiative and turn it into a national pilot program. It'll be the first time this kind of community-driven public safety model has been tested on such a large scale." Ryan sat back, absorbing the news. "National pilot program? That's huge. What's the plan?" Jordan nodded enthusiastically. "They're looking for cities willing to try it. We'd take the model we built and expand it, tweaking it based on the unique needs of different communities. They want to bring me on as a national advisor, but more importantly, they want your input." Ryan raised an eyebrow. "My input? I'm about to retire, Jordan. I'm not sure I'm the guy for this." Jordan shook his head, a grin spreading across his face. "You're exactly the guy for this. You've seen this work on the ground. You've lived it. And the fact that you've been in law enforcement gives you the credibility to convince other departments that this isn't just some idealistic dream, it's real, and it works." Ryan rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "It's a big ask. I've spent my entire career in this city. I'm not sure I'm ready for something on that scale." Jordan leaned in, his voice quieter now. "I know you're ready to step back, but think about it. This could be the final piece of the puzzle scaling this idea across the country. You could retire knowing that what we built here is making an impact everywhere. Just give it some thought." Ryan didn't respond immediately, but he knew Jordan had a point. The work they had started in their city had the potential to be something even greater. But after years of leading a department, Ryan wasn't sure if he had the energy for another national fight. "You'll think about it," Ryan said finally, his tone cautious. Jordan smiled. "That's all I'm asking." As Ryan approached the end of his tenure as police chief, he began preparing his department for the transition. He had mentored several officers who were strong candidates to succeed him, including Lieutenant Denise Martin, who had proven herself to be a capable leader and a dedicated advocate for the community-first approach they had built. One afternoon, Ryan called Denise into his office. "Denise, you've been one of the strongest leaders in this department for years," Ryan said, looking across his desk at her. "I've been thinking a lot about the future, and I believe you're ready to take the reins." Denise's eyes widened slightly, though she had suspected this moment was coming. "Chief, that means a lot. I've learned so much from you, and I believe in what we've built together. But I know there's still so much more to do." Ryan nodded, his face thoughtful. "That's exactly why I know you're the right person for this. You've always been driven by the same things that pushed me: justice, fairness, and a commitment to serving the people. This department needs someone like you to keep it moving forward." Denise sat in silence for a moment, the weight of Ryan's words settling on her shoulders. "Thank you, Chief. I won't let you down." "I know you won't," Ryan said, his voice filled with quiet confidence. "And remember, you're not doing this alone. Lean on your team, and don't be afraid to keep pushing for change, even when it's hard." As Denise left the office, Ryan felt a sense of peace. The future of the department was in good hands. It was time for him to step back and let the next generation lead. With his retirement officially announced, Ryan took a few weeks to reflect on Jordan's proposal. The idea of taking the Community Safety Initiative to a national level intrigued him, but he was also ready for a quieter life after years of public service. He spent more time with his family, enjoying the slower pace, but the thought of leaving the work behind nagged at him. One evening, Ryan found himself sitting on his back porch, the sun setting over the city skyline. The phone buzzed, and he saw a message from Jordan. "Still waiting on you, old man." Time's ticking. Ryan chuckled to himself, shaking his head. Jordan never gave up on a fight. That night, Ryan made his decision. He wasn't ready to walk away from it all just yet. The work they had started was too important, and if there was a chance to make a lasting impact on a national scale, he wanted to be a part of it. The next morning, Ryan called Jordan. "All right, I'm in. Let's do this." Jordan's voice was filled with triumph. "I knew you couldn't resist. This is going to be big, Ryan. We're about to change the game." With the decision made, Ryan found himself in Washington, D.C., meeting with lawmakers, community leaders, and law enforcement officials from across the country. The national pilot program was being rolled out in 10 major cities, and Ryan was instrumental in helping to shape its implementation. His experience in building the initiative from the ground up gave him a unique perspective, and his input was invaluable as they adapted the program to fit the specific needs of different communities. Jordan, as always, was right there with him, leading the charge from the legal side and ensuring that the program stayed true to its original goals of fairness, justice, and community empowerment. As the months passed, Ryan found himself energized by the work. He had thought he was ready for retirement, but this new mission gave him a renewed sense of purpose. The challenges were immense, but so were the rewards.
He watched as communities began to embrace the new model as officers and residents, and as the seeds of change spread from city to city.
2 years into the national pilot program, the results were undeniable. The Community Safety Initiative had reduced violent incidents, built stronger bonds between law enforcement and residents, and empowered communities to take control of their own safety. The program was hailed as a success, and plans were already underway to expand it to even more cities. Ryan, now in his mid-60s, knew it was finally time to step back for good. His work was done. He had helped lay the foundation for a new era of policing and community collaboration, and he had no doubt that the leaders who followed would continue to build on that legacy. As he stood on the steps of the Capitol, watching the latest round of national reforms being signed into law, Ryan felt a deep sense of fulfillment. He had spent his life fighting for justice, for fairness, and for a better future. And now that future was being realized. Jordan stood beside him, grinning. "Well, old man, we did it." Ryan smiled, his eyes reflecting both pride and relief. "Yeah, we did." They stood there together, watching the crowds below, knowing that their fight had been worth it. The road had been long, the challenges immense, but they had built something lasting, something that would shape the future for generations to come. And in that moment, Ryan knew that while his journey as a public servant was over, his legacy of justice, reform, and hope would live on. Ryan Carter had officially retired from his role as chief of police and had successfully completed his work on the national pilot program. Now, standing on the balcony of his home in Denver, he gazed out over the city that had shaped his life. After decades of service, he was finally stepping away from the day-to-day grind of law enforcement. But it didn't feel like the end. In many ways, it felt like a new beginning. Without the constant pressures of his old position, Ryan found himself reconnecting with old hobbies and passions that he hadn't had time for in years. He spent more time with his family, his wife Elena, and their 2 grown children, Tyler and Sophia. The past few years had been especially hard on them with Ryan's intense focus on work, and now he wanted to make up for lost time. One sunny afternoon, Ryan and Elena took a walk through the park, something they hadn't done in what felt like ages. The air was crisp, the leaves falling gently around them, and Ryan felt a sense of peace that he hadn't experienced in years. "You finally have time to slow down," Elena said with a smile as they strolled along the path. Ryan nodded. "It feels strange, but it's nice. I think I forgot what it was like to just be present." Elena squeezed his hand. "You've earned it, but I have a feeling you're not done yet." Ryan smiled, knowing she was right. Even in retirement, his mind still buzzed with thoughts about how he could continue making a difference. But this time, he would do it on his terms, without the constant demands of his old job weighing him down. A few months into his retirement, Ryan was approached by a local university to teach a course on ethical leadership and policing reform. The idea intrigued him. He had spent years putting these principles into practice, but now he had the opportunity to pass that knowledge on to the next generation of leaders. The thought of stepping into a classroom full of eager students, young people, who would one day be responsible for shaping the future of law enforcement, gave Ryan a renewed sense of purpose. He accepted the offer and began preparing for the course. On his first day at the university, Ryan felt a twinge of nervousness as he walked into the lecture hall. The students sat quietly, some of them looking excited, others curious, all waiting for the former police chief who had gained national recognition for his reforms. "Good afternoon," Ryan began, standing at the front of the class. "My name is Ryan Carter, and am here to talk to you about the future of policing." He paused, scanning the room before continuing. "But before we talk about the future, we need to understand the past, the mistakes, the challenges, and the moments when we didn't get it right. Because if we don't learn from those moments, we'll be doomed to repeat them." The room was silent as Ryan spoke, but he could feel the students' attention. Their interest peaked. Over the course of the semester, Ryan shared not just the victories he'd had in his career, but the hard lessons he had learned along the way. He emphasized the importance of empathy, listening, and above all, the responsibility that comes with the badge. Teaching gave Ryan a new outlet for his energy and passion. It wasn't the adrenaline-filled, high-stakes work of policing, but it was just as important. These students were the future, and he was determined to equip them with the tools they needed to lead with integrity. While Ryan was settling into his new role as an educator, Jordan Thompson's star continued to rise. His work on the national level had gained him a reputation as one of the most respected voices in the fight for justice reform. Jordan had helped pass landmark legislation that put ethical limits on the use of surveillance technology, created national standards for police accountability, and expanded community-led safety programs across the country. One afternoon, Jordan called Ryan from his office in Washington, D.C., and with some unexpected news. "Ryan, guess what?" Jordan said, his voice buzzing with excitement. "They want me to run for office." Ryan chuckled. "Who's they? And what office are we talking about here?" Jordan laughed. "A group of people who've been following my work think I should run for Congress. They want me to take this fight from the courtroom to the Capitol." Ryan wasn't entirely surprised. Jordan had always been a fighter, and he had the kind of charisma and conviction that made him a natural leader. "I can't say I didn't see this coming. Are you thinking about it?" "I am," Jordan admitted. "It's a huge responsibility, but I've been thinking about how much more we could accomplish with the right people in power. If I can push for change at the highest level, why not go for it?" Ryan nodded, though Jordan couldn't see it. "You've always said we need people inside the system to change it from within. This might be your chance to do just that." "I've been thinking the same thing," Jordan replied. "It's a big step, but I think it's the right one." As they talked, Ryan felt a deep sense of pride for his friend. Jordan had spent his life fighting for justice, and now he was on the verge of taking that fight to the national stage. The following year, Jordan launched his campaign for Congress. With his years of legal experience and his proven track record in reform, he quickly gained support from a wide range of voters. His platform focused on criminal justice reform, civil rights, and economic equality issues that had been central to his work for decades. Ryan, though retired, was actively involved in the campaign, offering advice and helping Jordan connect with key community leaders. He traveled with Jordan to campaign events, standing by his side as they continued to push for the changes they had always believed in. On the night of the election, Ryan sat in the campaign's headquarters, surrounded by Jordan's team, watching the results roll in. The energy in the room was electric, but Ryan remained calm, reflecting on everything they had accomplished together. When the final votes were tallied, it was official: Jordan had won the election. The room erupted into cheers, and Jordan was immediately swarmed by supporters and media. But as soon as he had a moment, Jordan made his way through the crowd to Ryan. "We did it, man," Jordan said, grinning from ear to ear. Ryan smiled, shaking his friend's hand before pulling him into a hug. "You did it! I'm proud of you." Jordan nodded, his expression turning serious for a moment. "None of this would have happened without you, Ryan. We've been in this together from the start." As the celebration continued, Ryan couldn't help but feel that this was only the beginning of something even bigger. Jordan's election to Congress meant that the work they had started years ago, the fight for justice, fairness, and accountability, was now being carried forward on a national level. And while Ryan was stepping back, he knew that the movement would continue to grow, led by people like Jordan, who were ready to take the next steps. As Ryan watched Jordan deliver his victory speech later that night, he felt a sense of closure and fulfillment. The work they had done together had made a lasting impact, not just in their city, but across the country. They had faced countless obstacles, but through it all, they had never given up. Ryan's life was quieter now, but it was filled with meaning. His time teaching at the university continued to bring him joy, and the students he mentored were already starting to make waves in the fields of law enforcement, social justice, and community activism. His influence would live on through them, and through the work Jordan was doing on a national scale. In the end, Ryan realized that the fight for justice never truly ended. It was passed down from one generation to the next, evolving with each new challenge. But he took comfort in knowing that the work would continue long after he was gone. And as he looked toward the future, Ryan Carter was filled with hope that the lessons they had learned, the battles they had fought, and the progress they had made would lead to a world that was fairer, more just, and filled with opportunity for all. As the story draws to a close, we want to thank you for joining us on this powerful journey of justice, friendship, and change. If you enjoyed this story and want more thought-provoking content like this, be sure to subscribe to our channel. Your support means the world to us, and it helps us continue sharing stories that inspire, challenge, and make a difference. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss an update, and feel free to share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear where you're watching from and what impact this story had on you. Subscribe now for more impactful stories and content that makes you think. We value your feedback, so if you enjoyed this story, leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for being part of our storytelling community, and stay tuned for more stories that remind us all that no matter how hard things get, we are never truly alone.